Hello, everybody, and welcome back to another episode of the Padres EVT Podcast in Focus. This is your host, Garcia. Joining me once again, EVT Padres staff writer and the person who runs the High Leverage Baseball Twitter account, Mr. Willy Warren. Welcome back to the show. I know for most of our regular listeners, it's been a couple of weeks, some behind-the-scenes stuff, but we are back and we are good to go. And go figure, just as we're about to start recording, some major trade news around the league kind of goes down with the Seattle Mariners picking up Brendan Donovan for a package that includes Jurangelo Cintjo, one of the top draft picks from last year's draft. Before we get going with our topics, Willie, your take on the trade, just based on what we know.
Yeah, that is absolutely huge. He'd been mentioned as someone who could have been moved for a while, and then I think earlier today it was announced that rival execs think he's going 100%. Trade develops, and it's really intriguing and really brings up a really interesting point we have today about how aggressive teams can be with advanced minor league data, knowing a little bit more about the prospects they can get in return for a guy like, a Brendan Donovan, who's, an all-star second baseman, but no superstar at that. And just kind of, it's really interesting now to see how like creative teams can be, in a trade around a player like that.
I think that's a brilliant point you bring up about the amount of information that's kind of out there about prospects, because when trade deadlines and the offseason kind of happens, I'll admit I'm guilty of this. We all try to be like, I guess you can call it an armchair GM from home. We all try to make what we think would be fair value for a trade, but the reality of the situation is we on the outside with publicly available data have just a smidge of what is available to front offices who have things like synergy, where they can isolate independent, like individual pitches and get all of the metrics with IVB, horizontal break. And there are some great publicly available sources that do a brilliant job of documenting that. But with that, my question to you is, do you think that makes it harder to analyze, player development from the outside?
I think the data itself definitely adds some complexity to it, but overall, I feel like it makes it a little easy for teams to know what type of player they're getting back, because there's no one stat that says this is how reliable they are, this is what their ceiling is, this is what their floor is. There's just the fact that you can gauge through so many different sections of areas, and you take a guy like Jurangelo Cintjo for an example, who's going over to St. Louis in the deal. He's a switch pitcher, and there's got to be so many things you could pick from him, and just stuff that back maybe 10, 15 years ago you wouldn't be able to gauge multiple fastball shapes for a specific pitcher, or be able to judge all these things that are kind of available now. And so I think that's something that we're seeing around the league a lot more often, is teams being really aggressive now that they have that data on outside players, like you said.
It's really just fascinating how much player analysis and development has just changed over the last 10, 15 years. 10, 11 years ago, an arm like Cole Stewart was a top 50 prospect in MLB, and he never topped out above 95. And back then, thinking back to those days of players again, Cole Stewart is the one example that sticks with me. I know there's others, but I'm just drawing blanks on their names, where, they put up a really good minor league ERA, but when they were striking out 6.5 batters per nine, which even then batters per nine is not really looked at as much compared to overall strikeout rate or whiff percentages, swing and strike percentages, just the amount of lanes that teams have to analyze who they want. And even then, players and teams are looking for certain parameters or certain things to look for. For example, the Padres love guys who have fastballs with two planes of movement. It's not all just pure IVB, even though they do have some IVB monsters like Jeremiah Estrada on the team. They have an idea of kind of what they're looking for in terms of the properties of a pitch, which when you can analyze that specifically in any sense of, your overall scouting, like it's a great time to be someone who wants to learn about player evaluation. It's a great time to be really interested in the minor leagues and the draft because there's so much changing every year.
Yeah, I can definitely attest to that as someone who's trying to get into player development, player analysis. It's just so awesome how much, like, if you really sit and you take the time, like the tools are there, and you can really dig really deep into just how, like, what type of player like the player in question is. And it's kind of interesting how it also kind of negates the value of guys who put up the traditional counting stats. And so you've guys like the Padres Luis Campusano and the Dodgers Ryan Ward, who are putting up
Insane slash
20,
last
like
year.
27 home runs, 25 home runs, batting near or over 300. Like, and from maybe 15 years ago, you would see a front office say, like, this is the next guy, like, we're gonna go after him. And nowadays they're like, they can hit the pause button and just say, well, we don't like this, or we don't like that, or we have concerns about this, or we don't think this will stick. You didn't hit the ball as hard. Like, there's so many different, there's so much new complexity to it that kind of adds a layer and allows just everybody's kind of in play when it comes to scouting, not just the top guys anymore.
That's one of the fascinating things about it. We can find hidden talent in the minor leagues or even in the independent leagues or foreign leagues as well. I know one guy I was looking at recently, Sadrak Franco, who was pitching in the Mexican League, signed a minor league deal with the Padres. Reportedly, like, the velo was getting up to 98, 99, and this is a guy that has been in the minor leagues before. But just now, and then seeing with Driveline, all the guys that go to their pro days and get signed, like Riley Pint and Michael Flynn, who just signed with the Padres. Stephen Jones, who was with the Padres organization last year, got signed by the Marlins. It's just an example of how many different ways there are to assess players. And at this point, it's only going to grow how much you can analyze, how much you can look into. There's going to be just so much more.
Yeah, and it's gonna grow and continue to just expand on like how much you can kind of analyze with these guys. But I mean, we're also seeing we're not just seeing this as fans, and like MLB front offices are also taking this stuff into account, and we're seeing probably, I think, the highest like rate of usage on the trade market than I think we've ever seen, at least in this off season we have here, where you've guys like Freddie Peralta and Mackenzie Gore and Jose A. Ferrer. That was happened a lot earlier in the off season, but like you're just kind of continuing to see guys who they might not be the highest profile. You might not be sure about them, but teams see that like teams that hold players like that will see like 4 or 5 guys they might like in the other team's system with all this new advanced data. And for example, with Gore, we saw him go over for 5 guys, none of which are in MLB.com's top 100 list, like that just came out. And that's just something that I feel like is so new. That's such a new and exciting concept to kind of the nature of the trade market.
It's fascinating how it's continuing to develop. I will say this about the Jose Ferrer deal, which honestly one of the most fascinating trades this past offseason, because they traded Harry Ford for a reliever, was kind of the discourse in the general public. For me, it was they traded one guy who plays the saxophone for another guy who plays the saxophone. So I mean, I think if the real ball knowers will get that there's this great video of Ferrer having a saxophone lesson out there on the Nationals Twitter page. And as someone who is a musician, it is the funniest thing ever. Every time I hear about Jose Ferrer, I have to mention that. I'm not sorry. But speaking of the top 100 lists, when we spoke with Sam a couple weeks ago on our podcast, he mentioned the top 100 lists were coming out. They have since been released. I know MLB.com, MLB Pipeline has released theirs. The Padres only have one top 100 prospect as of right now.
Yeah, that's going to come in at number 88 on their list. Cruz Schoolcraft becomes the only Padres prospect on that list, and Ethan Salas, he was named as a near miss, but was left outside of the top 100 after he was as high as I think 6, 8 maybe. He had been a as the top signing of that international class. Like that is considerable fall, and even though we talk about how he's dealt with the back injury, how he's still finding his his swing at the plate, he's been challenged, the numbers might not be there like that. I find it just fascinating that from then to now, the Padres now have a single prep arm in the top 100 after Salas led what was considered one of the really stronger farm systems in the league.
It's interesting that with Salas, he's a very mercurial prospect at this point in time. It's so hard to gauge what he can be. I know in working on our East Village Times top 30, Salas is the one that is just, there's so many conflicting words that can be used to describe him, because he has all the talent in the world, but he hasn't been able to stay healthy. But at the same time, they did kind of rush him to high A for a guy who, he kind of played a little bit in the lower 3 levels of the minor leagues. And then, oh, here you go. Your first assignment's in high A, where pitchers are not just throwing, but actually pitching the ball, working on sequencing. And, oh, yeah, you have to manage a whole new pitching staff. And also you have to adjust to pitchers who are, using major league caliber stuff, albeit even if it's somewhat raw. So I want to get your thoughts before we continue with Salas, because I don't want to overlook Schoolcraft in the slightest. I want to get your thoughts on, because he's at 88 right now. What do you think a successful season for him looks like?
I think with him, because he only made one start that was we got data on, or got to even see him on MILB TV or anything like that. So he's very, very there's not a whole lot that you could really place in terms of a tangible expectation, but I do want to see this stuff. I do want to see the velocity. I want to see just all of that kind of hype that's brought him to be on this list, that's brought him to be the Padres' next number one prospect. And so I'd love to see it stick up at over a full season. I'd love to see these strikeout numbers stay up. But the one thing I won't really concern myself with is if he's walking too many, if he has a release point issue, or if he's he's huge. That's stuff. I'm sure stuff like that is going to happen. There's going to be bumps in the road, but just seeing those flashes over an entire season is what I'm really looking for out of Schoolcraft.
There we go. I think that is a really good way to articulate it, because we have a very tiny sample size. I think it's 37 pitches worth of data from him this past season. I know that game was probably the most watched, or at least one of the most watched minor league games for the Padres this past year, because he's huge, he throws gas, and he's got a pretty wicked changeup to boot, and the breaking ball is definitely going to develop. I wanted to pull up how Cash Mayfield did last year as a reference, because I know they're very different arms. To me, I see Mayfield as kind of like a Cole Hamels in terms of he's more command and he's got the changeup. And then Cruz, It's really hard to think of a comparison when you think tall left-handed pitcher that throws absolute gas, because you don't want to say Randy Johnson. Like, that's the thing. You obviously don't want to say that because that's a huge cloud. That's a huge expectation to put on a prospect. But I think when I looked at how Mayfield did last year, he struck out 34.1% of batters. He had a walk rate just under 11%. With Cruz, considering where he is at right now, I would project him to have like a FIP in the mid threes, a strikeout percentage around 30%. The walk rate's going to be around, I'd say 8 to 12%, because it is the Cal League. There's a lot of free swinging, but there's also a lot of command issues. The average strikeout rate in the Cal League is 20% for pitchers, which is below the league average of 23%. So there's definitely, he's got a great runway to be successful. I think if he can have a consistent breaking ball, even if it's just one consistent breaking ball, either the slider or the curveball, like, we might be talking about, like, yeah, he's a high school pitcher, but could he be up in like 2 years? That's a huge expectation, but he's talented enough to where you can kind of see that a little bit. I mean, I hope it's not too high an expectation. What are kind of your thoughts there?
I mean, yeah, it's definitely tough to say someone that's that young and that raw to put that type of tag on him. But someone who has his frame, his like athleticism, he was a two-way player coming out of high school, and Sam was talking about last week how much he loves guys like that and how they play well, and they kind of find their way through the ins and outs of being a prospect. And I do think it's really interesting because like you kind of said, there's not really a comp for him. There's not a pathway that really feels right for him. And I mean, as someone who's my age, it's tough not to look at like a Garrett Crochet type, or someone like it's tough. It's tough to really put a kind of pathway on him to where you see him doing this, you see him ending here. Like, he could be one of those one of those guys who has a really, really quick start and then gets pushed out of to more advanced stuff, or he could be someone who doesn't get off the ground running too hard and maybe makes that push later, like we saw out of Miguel Mendez. Like, I mean, it's kind of just it's just gonna be really, really fun to see where he goes with his base, because that was one of the things that we talked about last week. So he has an amazing base to become a great pitcher.
I will agree. I kept thinking, I was like, when you said Garrett Crochet, like, that's the best like major league comp in terms of like his size. And then I remembered a prospect from about 10 years ago by the name of Justin Hooper, who was drafted in 2015 and then 2019 again. But when Hooper was coming out of high school, he's 6'8", throwing, again, 6'8", throwing gas, very similar to Cruz, except when he went to college, at UCLA, his coaches completely revamped how he was pitching to increase his control. And I think with the Padres and Cruz specifically, what I could see them going for more of a let it eat sort of thing, where you've got this really great base of a strong fastball, a really strong changeup for his age. I think they're gonna, I have faith in this team's player development and especially in their pitching development, because they always seem to have guys who just kind of come out of nowhere and they're like, where did this guy come from? Like Mendez, and then guys like Ryan Berger, who wasn't a particularly high pick, but he turned out to be pretty good. Stephen Kolek went from your mop-up guy to solid back-end starter. So I think that this organization, especially with Cruz, they've got like you said, they've got a good base, and they're definitely going to be going in the right direction there. And another thing with pitchers, you mentioned this before we went live, Humberto Cruz is going to be missing all of next year with Tommy John. And, he's a prospect who, again, came in with a little bit less hype than Ethan Salas, but I believe he was still the same international signing period. He might have been Leo DeVries' signing period, if I remember correctly, but he came in with a lot of hype, but he went under the knife. So now you think, what does that do for him going forward? Like, what do you think we're going to see out of Humberto Cruz when he gets back?
Yeah, well, it's really interesting. Like whenever you have a guy like that who doesn't throw a ton of, I mean, I don't think he might have, scratched this surface of playing in the Cal League, but doesn't have a ton of innings under him, and then he goes through, something like Tommy John, and you don't really know what's going to come out on the other side of that. But I looked into him a little bit and how he throws. He does have a really great arm swing to his pitch, but a lot of his velocity came from his lower half. And as someone who throws, he throws a sinker and a changeup. I think he's poised for a good bounce back from that. It's obviously it's tough. You can't really profile someone to be a good candidate to bounce like back from something like that, but someone who doesn't fully rely on velocity, and someone who has that strong floor of the ground ball ability. I think that he's someone who could who could kind of fly back onto the radar after he comes back in 2027.
I think that's a great way to put it, really. I mean, with Humberto, for me, it was really hard grading him again in the process of creating the top 30 that's going to be coming out. Today, we're recording this on the 2nd. This is going to be released on the 5th. Wait, whatever this Friday is, the 5th or the 6th. And then the top prospect list should be out on the 13th or 14th is the goal. But back to Humberto Cruz for a minute, it was really hard to gauge kind of what to expect from him, because seeing him pitch in the Cal League, there were days when he was on, like, he was touching 96. And the sinker just had impressive downward movement. It was nasty, for lack of a better word. And I think the changeup was just a solid, it projects fairly well. I think the Padres and guys with good changeups, they seem to have a good base for what they're going to do going forward. And since Cruz, he's more of a drop and drive kind of guy, because a lot, like you said, a lot of it comes from the lower body. So I think he has a better chance of kind of retaining some of that velocity if and when he returns, because he's not relying on just, here you go, I'm going to throw 100 at you with just my arm. It's like he's really making the most of that kinetic transfer of energy in his mechanics. So I think with him, when he gets healthy, he's definitely going to be on a lot of people's radar, because he was a pretty big signing bonus when he signed. He's had quite a bit of fanfare early on, and there are games where he showed what he could be. It's just a shame that he had to go under the knife so soon in his career, because if he had a really healthy season next year, and by that I mean, I keep forgetting we're in 2026. If he has a really healthy, if he had a healthy season in 2026, I think we're talking borderline top 100 in all of MLB sort of arm, because of his youth. He has decent frame that could add some muscle, add some mass to, give him the sort of projectability of a starter long term. Because again, the whole idea of like a starter's build is kind of just it's just an idea, because we've seen guys like Tristan McKenzie, and there's also been guys like Alfredo Simon in the past who have had larger builds and been successful. So I think with Cruz, the idea with Humberto Cruz, because we had Cruz and then Cruz Schoolcraft, so going from one to the other, it's like, okay, which Cruz are we talking about? But with Humberto Cruz, when he gets back, if the velocity stays, I'm expecting 92, 93 when he gets back, while he gets acclimated to the new UCL. But if he can keep some of the life on those pitches and, sort of show that he has that command from before he signed, he's going to be in a really good spot.
Yeah, and it's easy to see a guy like him who's sinker, changeup, and kind of compare him to a guy like Bradley Rodriguez, who just got his shot with the Padres in 2025. Except for like the one big thing, he pitches more with his lower half, and a guy like Bradley Rodriguez is all upper, kind of like you said. I mean, that's the first thing I thought of when you said someone who just throws 100 at you with their arm. That's kind of a guy like Rodriguez, and that's why I think he Cruz would have a chance to remain a starter even after all that adversity. There's the one thing I want to see from him is as someone who likes to keep the ball on the ground, he gives up a lot of homers, and I have a 1.89 homers per 9 in 38 innings that he pitched, that were tracked by Fangraphs. And I just want to get your concern level on a stat like that, as someone who you're hoping works on the ground more, might give up some hard contact, but should effectively limit fly balls.
I think it's a question of just where he's landing his strikes in the zone, because when he missed, he was getting hit pretty hard. Now, if we look at the swinging strike rates and all that, he had a 14.5 swinging strike rate in his time at Single A, which is a little bit above average. So it's good. The thing with the Cal League is half the time they're playing in the desert, and the other half of the time there's elevation. Like Lake Elsinore is a weird ballpark because of the outfield dimensions, but the left field wall is alarmingly low compared to the right field wall, which has the ad monster, which is, I don't know, about 30 feet in the air. Just, ads upon ads upon ads. It's like if you took Fenway and like flipped it, kind of. Just to kind of, for those of you who haven't seen or been to the Diamond at Lake Elsinore, just kind of give you a picture of how that is. I will say, the minor league, especially the Cal League, it's rather hitter friendly. So I think for Humberto, he's going to see some regressions to the mean in terms of, the fly ball percentage and the fly ball per home run percentage. Because let me pull up this number that you were a 22% home run per fly ball ratio all of last year, and then 33.3% in Single A alone. There's no way that it's going to be sustainable. Like, there's no way you can allow home runs on one of every 3 fly balls that you give up in a season. Like, I think that's just so unbelievably high that, and especially for a guy like him who's sinker heavy, like it's such an alarming anomaly. You can't not think it's going to get better. It's just, there's no way it's staying that high.
No, yeah, that's a fair point there. That it is tough. I always don't account very well for the the conditions that the different leagues play in and how that works. But I do think that that was just something that jumped off the page to me, that I was like, the ball is supposed to be down there and not up there. Yeah. But I do think his fly ball percentage alone was better. It was closer to the mean, as you said. I do think that he will do a good job in larger sizes of of keeping the ball on the ground, and it would be really, really nice to the farm system as like a whole if Cruz will be tested this season. Cash Mayfield's there. His stuff was great this year, but beyond that of those two, not counting Miguel Mendez, who's who's about a level ahead of them. The Padres don't really have that clear fourth starter. Now with that injury, and it would be really, really nice for their system as a whole, especially with how the overall rankings have been going, just to see them get some more depth at starting pitcher in the system as a whole.
True, they definitely have a lot of guys who have the opportunity to just step up and be that guy. Jagger Haynes could step up and be that guy. Carson Montgomery and Tucker Musgrove, who are in the AFL, could be that guy. Eric Yost could be that guy. You know, there are Michael Salina, when he returns, will definitely be that guy. Because, you know, when he's throwing 98 to 102 as a starter in college, and like, even if he's only throwing 96 to 98, like when he gets back, I know it's going to be a while before he throws 4 innings in a game because they're building the arm strength back up. But there are guys in this system who can sort of be that fourth starter of the future. Would have been Braden Nett or Henry Baez, but to get good players, you got to give up good players. So I think this system, I'm going to say this over and over again, I think this system is incredibly slept on. There are some guys who, you know, when you tell people about, they'll be like, who's this guy? And then they'll look at them and be like, oh, this guy was that good. So it's I think it's more of a good thing that it's kind of slept on, to be quite honest, because then you get to enjoy the breakout in relative obscurity.
Yeah, I mean that is true. A good point. You know, you get to, you know, it's always fun. You know, like I can tell you firsthand. You know, reading all up about who this Miguel Mendez was just like super exciting, and it's, you know, super fun, and watching Net grow to, you know, becoming like a kind of number 10 or guy to the number 3, I believe, or some, you know, or like kind of around that range. And I guess the only downside to that is that you don't have the luxury of making trades in the off season with those guys because, you know, they haven't broken out yet. And, you know, I know that this is definitely not as time when the Padres need to be super aggressive with moving guys out of their system, but they still are trying to meet a, you know, competitive window that's kind of set out for them, and they have some deals that are going to start looking a little worse. And that's just, I guess, the one thing about the underrated piece that, you know, might not benefit, you know, us as fans, is that we kind of look at some of these deals that go down and say, oh, we should have been able to make that, or, you know, like that doesn't feel like a high price, or that sort of thing is the only kind of piece that comes with the system being, you know, heavily underrated.
Definitely. And I think, speaking of the team and what they can do this year, Padres Fan Fest was this past weekend. I did not go. I was sick, but I heard all about it. We saw, you know, kind of the quotes coming out of Fan Fest from Craig Stammen, from the players, from AJ Preller. And there's going to be some roster battles this spring. Now, for those of us who are listening on YouTube or whatever platform you may be listening on, Willy here did a great breakdown of some of the roster battles that this team is facing coming up in spring training. So I'll let you kind of lead the way on what do you think is going to be the roster battle to watch.
Yeah, there's a few spots that are not really set in stone yet. You know, we talked a couple weeks ago about, is JP Sears the real fifth starter, and, or, you know, what could they do with the last spot in the bullpen? Like, could they give it to Garrett Hawkins? I know that was an idea we entertained, but I think the biggest priority is probably with the right side of the infield. And, you know, that's not, it might not be the most concerning one, as they have some depth there, but at least, you know, in hearing Craig Stammen talking about that, and, you know, he stated that he believes Gavin Sheets is kind of their leading, you know, candidate for that spot at first going into spring training, but they still have, you know, Jake Cronenworth in the mix. They still have Sung Mun Song, who's expected to be back even like as spring training starts from his oblique injury. So it's going to be really interesting seeing what they do there. And although I think it's an absolute long shot I do wonder if Luis Campusano will be given even a chance to potentially win starts at first base against left-handed pitching. It's a total. Yeah, I mean, you can go speak to that. I know you're not as big of a Luis fan as I am, but
I think it's interesting because from sitting and checking all the updates from FanFest, I saw that Craig Stammen mentions how Campusano's going to have every chance to fight for his way on the roster, because Campy has caught Craig, so Craig knows what he can do behind the dish. They're looking at him apparently to spend most of his time catching. Do I agree with that? No, because I know he's caught a no-hitter. And I'm not trying to go all Stephen A or, Colin Coward right now, but he's caught a no-hitter, but the pitchers don't really like throwing to him. Like he's good framing on the inside of the plate, but anything outside, you wonder, how did this guy make it this far as a catcher? And is he going to get that statue in El Paso? Probably, after the year he just had. But he didn't play catcher. He played first base and DH. And then last year when he got called up, now that's a whole different story about why he didn't play catcher. But I don't know how many reps they have for him, considering they want to get a look at Ethan Salas during spring training. They did sign Blake Hunt with a minor league deal and an invite to spring training. So I think it's between Blake Hunt and Campy for the backup spot behind Fermin. Now, in an ideal world, Campy gets his act together behind the plate, learns from Fermin, who learned from Salvador Perez, like one of the great catchers of this generation, and can be a serviceable defensive catcher. But I think the question for me is just going to be, can he swing the bat at pitches that are actually hittable in the major leagues this year?
Yeah, that's a fair question. I mean, I don't really get it how someone can go from being one of the greatest hitters at the level right below to not being able to get a hit in 20 at bats like that. I mean, amazes me as someone, especially considering the fact that he's played a good chunk of time at the major league level before. And so, we will always dream that he'll go back to those couple weeks, that month he had of 2023 when, we all thought, we all thought he was just, sure, we don't know what type of defender he's going to be, but, having a plus offensive catcher is really, really, really valuable. And so I would have to believe that's what, Craig sees in him. I know that was something he was talking about, and one of his very first moves he made, actions he made, was he went out to the Dominican Republic to go watch him play in a winter league game, which I found really, really intriguing. And paired with his comments, there aren't as many reps, I would think, but catching. But I wouldn't be shocked if they get really creative with where he plays and what he does, because if he can provide even a decent translation of how good he was in El Paso last year, like you're not really looking at your average bench hitter. Like you're looking at a guy who could win starts over some of the guys, at least compared to the level of, offensive production that they got from behind the plate and at first base and from their DH spot last year, especially against left-handed pitching. So I'd be really intrigued. I think that's probably my most intriguing kind of position battle situation to watch, is what they do with Mr. Campusano over there.
The last thing I'll say about Campusano is I think the fact that he has support from within the organization now is going to do huge things for him. I know I'm not as high on him as certain other people out there. I mean, But, you know, at the end of the day, if he's a player on the team that I follow, I want him to do well. That's just the bottom line when it comes to Campusano. My personal opinions aside, you know, you want him to do well because he's on the team that you follow. And, you know, speaking of players who you want them to do well, I think it was so interesting to me just how much the guys were talking up Randy Vasquez. Because, you know, the meme was kind of a thing of Randy Vasquez has devil magic because he walks almost the same amount of guys that he strikes out, but something flipped at the end of the year. Like when he started against the Brewers and he struck out like 9 in 6 innings. Like there was clearly something there. And his last outing when he came in out of the bullpen throwing 98, you're like, okay, there's definitely something here. So I know that James and Nick have discussed this on the R&R, the EVT show, but we haven't really talked about him as much here. So is Randy Vasquez, do you think, a lock for the starting rotation, or do you think he has to earn it this year?
I think absolutely he is a lock because, you know, you look at his data, his baseball savant page, and, you know, nothing jumps out. You don't see really anything except for his, you know, base production. Like, you know, he had a 3.84 ERA and, you know, 28 starts last season. That's, you know, easily, you know, 4th, 5th starter caliber production. But then when you get into the pieces that, you know, he's learning, he's growing, he's, you know, he's spending a lot of time with Darvish and like all that stuff, and kind of, you know, you just see a little bit more than just a pitch to contact guy, throws everything in the kitchen sink guy. Like you see, like he is a really advanced pitcher when it just comes to sequencing, location, the stuff that is a little bit more tough to like track is, you know, just those smaller intangibles that, you know, that really make him that pitcher that, you know, makes you want to think, oh, well, he has devil magic. You know, he's just really advanced, kind of under the underlying, if you will. Like I think he's just gonna get better and better because of the fact that he's willing to grow, and he's kind of looks like he's settled into the type of pitcher that he is. I think that was one of the first things that kind of came out on him, was that he tries to be someone that he isn't. He tries to throw harder than he throws. He tries to get more swings and misses than he's going to get. And I think ever since he's really bought into that, just I'm going to be perfect, you know, in every single at bat. Like I think ever since that, I think he's been really effective, and he doesn't feel like you're holding your breath in it anymore, just hoping he hits it to someone. Like, you know, I feel like there's a real sense there that he could be a lock in this rotation for the next, you know, 3-4 years, you know, however long. I'm not sure how many years he has left until
I think it's
the market.
3
years
or
yeah.
4. I think it's 4 actually.
4.
It's 4.
That feels about right. But yeah. I just think he's someone who's not gonna, you know, because someone who doesn't get as much swing and misses as he does, it's kind of easy to think that they're not gonna be able to sustain that level of production. But just with how advanced he is, how like that feel he has for every one of his pitches, and like all those, you know, small things that are off the charts, like I think he's just going to get better with every season under his belt. I'd be curious to hear an outside opinion, because I don't think he gets talked about in depth very often. It's really just, you know, the ball's on the ground, the ball's here. It's like, it's very
the ball's in the gloves.
Yeah, the ball's.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I will say with Randy, I think, because I was pretty high on him when he came over in the Soto trade. I loved his Tops Now card in MLB The Show the year before, because when he debuted against the Padres. And the one thing I will say with Randy is the stuff's always been there. I've always liked it personally. I think this is going to be a really confusing sentence, but I feel like he's a little advanced beyond what the advanced metrics will tell you, as kind of confusing as that might be. But, I'm looking forward to seeing him in spring training, seeing what, adjustments he makes, how he goes after hitters. And, the last little thing I'll ask you about is outside of, what's Campy's fit on the roster, what do you think is going to be like the biggest storyline this spring when it comes to the roster? What other roster battle do you think it's going to be? Something on the pitching side, or is it going to be something in the batter's box?
I would have to say, just with how kind of set the Padres are at, all like most of their spots in the lineup outside of first out of first base. I think it's the biggest thing to watch is just going to be, do they get aggressive with a guy like Miguel Mendez or a guy like Garrett Hawkins? I mean, I don't see it. I wouldn't say that they are like either of them are the likely choice to make the opening day roster. But I mean, then you kind of look at what they've done in the past before, and they took Jackson Merrill was a little more easier, but then they also took Graham Pauley out to Korea to play in his first big I mean, they can get really, really, really aggressive with those type of promotions. And so I would just love to see what they decide to do with Hawkins and Mendez, depending on how well they pitch, both being on the 40-man roster. Like they're not just those like long shot, just see how they do versus better competition. Like they could seriously, like not just make the team, but then have a greater ceiling of impact than any of the guys that are currently in the mix. So yeah, I think it'll come on the pitching side of things for sure with those two arms.
That is definitely an interesting storyline that we will continue to watch as spring training kind of gets underway. Pitchers and catchers are reporting, I believe, a couple days after this podcast releases.
Yes.
So if you're listening to this on Friday, pitchers and catchers report in 3 days. So get your notebooks out, get your scorebooks ready, and we'll be here covering spring training, minor leagues, anything that we hear, anything that we can really get our hands on, for lack of a better word. And be sure to check out the links in the description for EastVillageTimes.com, as well as the other East Village Times Padres podcast, hosted by our editor-in-chief, James Clark, and staff writer, Nick Lee. I know they've done a great job they've had Dan Szymborski on the show. James just had a chat with Jim Callis the other day. Really interesting stuff, and it's a very different perspective from, what we're doing with all the player analysis things. They're giving you a bit of more of a macro view on the team and what more than what we are doing. And I think if you enjoy our show, check theirs out. It's definitely a different perspective, but I think there's still quite a bit to hear, quite a bit to think about, regardless of which show you choose to watch. So thank you all very much for tuning into this episode of Padres EVT Podcast in Focus. On behalf of staff writer Willy Warren, this is host Diego Garcia saying thank you all so very much for listening. We'll see you all again next time.